Sarah Martinez had always been different from other war correspondents. While most journalists stayed behind the safety lines, she pushed deeper into conflict zones, driven by an unshakable belief that the world needed to see the truth. At 28, she had already covered 3 major conflicts, each assignment more dangerous than the last. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned village as Sarah adjusted her camera strap and checked her equipment one final time. Her fixer Ahmed had warned her about venturing into this particular area. The rebel forces had been pushed back here just days ago, leaving behind a maze of bombed buildings and hidden dangers. "This is not wise, Miss Sarah," Ahmed had said, his weathered face creased with worry. "The government soldiers, they shoot first and ask questions later in this place." But Sarah had made up her mind. Intelligence reports suggested that civilians were trapped in the village, cut off from aid for weeks. Someone needed to document their story, to show the world what was happening in this forgotten corner of the war. She carried minimal equipment, her camera, a satellite phone, water bottles, and her grandfather's old service pistol with a single ammunition clip. The gun was more for peace of mind than anything else. Sarah had never fired it outside a shooting range, but in a war zone even journalists needed protection. The village looked like a ghost town. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, and debris littered the streets. Every step echoed eerily in the silence. Sarah moved carefully, documenting the destruction while staying alert for any signs of life. As she rounded a corner near what used to be the town square, she heard voices, not the scared whispers of civilians but the harsh commands of soldiers. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against a crumbling wall, trying to make sense of the Arabic being shouted nearby. Through a gap in the wall, she could see them, at least a dozen government soldiers setting up a checkpoint. They weren't supposed to be here. According to her sources, this area was still contested territory, supposedly empty of military presence. Sarah knew she should retreat, but something made her pause. Behind the soldiers, she glimpsed movement in a partially collapsed building. Civilians, maybe an entire family on down, were hiding in the ruins, too scared to move. She raised her camera, knowing that these images could be crucial evidence of the military's presence in what was supposedly a neutral zone. The photos could expose violations of the ceasefire agreement and potentially save lives. But as she focused her lens, a piece of rubble shifted under her foot. The small sound seemed to echo like thunder in the tense silence. Every soldier's head turned in her direction, and Sarah realized with growing dread that her position was completely exposed. Time seemed to slow as the first soldier spotted her. His shout alerted the others, and suddenly the entire checkpoint erupted into action. Sarah clutched her camera protectively while her other hand instinctively moved to the pistol at her side. She was trapped between the soldiers ahead and a maze of unstable buildings behind her. The weight of her single ammunition clip felt both reassuring and terrifyingly inadequate. 40 trained soldiers against one journalist with a camera, and barely enough bullets to matter. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had walked straight into the most dangerous situation of her career, and there was no easy way out. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out to surround her position. Sarah counted at least 20 men now visible, their rifles trained in her direction. She could hear boots crunching on debris from other directions. They were completing the encirclement. American journalist. She called out in Arabic, raising her hands while keeping her camera visible. "Press, international press." A harsh laugh came from the squad leader, a stocky man with sergeant's stripes and cold eyes. "Journalists don't carry weapons," he replied in accented English, nodding toward the pistol at her hip. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to buy time to think of a way out of this nightmare. The civilians she had spotted were still hidden in the ruins behind the checkpoint, probably terrified by the commotion. Getting to them now seemed impossible. "I have credentials," she said, slowly reaching for her press badge. "I'm documenting the humanitarian situation. There are international laws protecting journalists." "Your laws mean nothing here," the sergeant spat. "This is a military zone. You are either a spy or a terrorist sympathizer." More soldiers appeared from side streets and buildings. Sarah realized with sinking heart that there were nearly 40 of them now, forming a loose circle around her position. Each carried an assault rifle, and several had already fixed bayonets. The message was clear. They weren't taking chances. The sergeant barked orders in rapid Arabic. Half the soldiers remained focused on Sarah, while the others began searching the surrounding buildings. They had obviously been planning a sweep of the area when she stumbled into their operation. Sarah's training kicked in. She had survived dangerous situations before by staying calm and thinking strategically. The soldiers hadn't shot her immediately, which meant they wanted her alive, at least for now. That gave her some leverage. "I know you have orders about foreign journalists," she said, addressing the sergeant directly. "Killing a correspondent from an international news organization creates problems for your government. Bad publicity, diplomatic incidents." The sergeant's expression suggested he was considering her words, but his rifle never wavered. Around them, the other soldiers grew restless. Some were younger, barely out of their teens, and Sarah could see the nervous energy building. Young soldiers in tense situations made mistakes. A radio crackled somewhere in the group. The sergeant listened to a rapid exchange of Arabic, his frown deepening. When the communication ended, he looked back at Sarah with renewed suspicion. "My commander wants to know what you photographed," he said. "Give me the camera memory cards and perhaps you leave here alive." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The photos she had taken showed not just the military presence but also evidence of the hidden civilians. If the soldiers discovered those people, the consequences could be deadly. Civilians caught in military operations were often treated as enemy combatants. "The camera contains only pictures of destroyed buildings." She lied smoothly. "Architecture documentation for reconstruction planning." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew her situation was deteriorating rapidly. The radio chatter suggested reinforcements were coming. Soon there would be even more soldiers, making escape impossible. She glanced around desperately, looking for any advantage. The ruins offered some cover, but they were also unstable. One wrong move could bring down walls and trap her further. The distance to the nearest building was about 30 yards, too far to run before being shot down. Her hand brushed against the pistol again. 15 rounds against 40 soldiers was suicide. But it might create enough chaos for the hidden civilians to escape. Sometimes a journalist's job required more than just observing and recording. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah could feel sweat trickling down her back despite the cool morning air. The soldiers remained in position, weapons ready, while their sergeant continued his radio communications with higher command. During one of these exchanges, Sarah caught a break. A young soldier to her left, barely 18 by the look of him, let his attention wander. He was watching something in the distance, probably more troops arriving. For just a moment, his rifle barrel drifted away from her. Sarah took a careful step backward, then another. The rubble-strewn ground made silent movement nearly impossible, but she managed to put a few feet between herself and the closest soldiers. Every inch mattered now. The sergeant finished his radio call and turned back to her with a grim expression. "My orders have changed," he announced. "You will come with us for questioning. Any resistance will be considered an act of terrorism." This was exactly what Sarah had feared. Once they took her to their base, her chances of survival dropped to almost zero. Foreign journalists who disappeared in war zones were rarely seen again. She had to make her move now, while she still had some freedom of movement. "I understand," she said, raising her hands higher. "I'll cooperate fully," but as she spoke, she was calculating distances and angles. The collapsed wall to her right offered the best cover if she could reach it. The pile of concrete blocks would stop rifle bullets and give her a chance to plan her next move. The sergeant gestured for 2 soldiers to approach and disarm her. As they moved forward, their formation loosened slightly. It was the opening Sarah had been waiting for. She dove hard to the right, rolling behind the concrete barrier just as the first shots rang out. Bullets whined off the rubble around her, sending up clouds of dust and stone fragments. The soldiers were shouting now, coordinating their positions to surround her new hiding spot. Sarah pulled out her pistol and checked the clip one more time. 15 rounds. She would have to make every shot count. But her goal wasn't to win a firefight. It was to create enough confusion and chaos to escape. Peering around the edge of her cover, she saw the soldiers advancing in a coordinated assault. They moved in pairs, one providing covering fire while the other advanced. Professional military tactics that would overwhelm her position in minutes. But Sarah had one advantage they didn't expect. She knew exactly where she was going. Earlier, while documenting the village, she had noticed a partially collapsed tunnel entrance near the old marketplace. It was probably part of the town's ancient water system, and it led in the direction of the civilian safe zone several miles away. The tunnel entrance was about 50 yards from her current position, across open ground. Under normal circumstances, it would be an impossible run. But if she could create enough distraction, force the soldiers to take cover for even a few seconds, she might make it. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She fired 3 quick shots over the heads of the advancing soldiers, not trying to hit them but forcing them to duck for cover. The psychological effect was immediate. These soldiers were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. As they scrambled for better positions, Sarah sprinted from her hiding spot. She ran in a zigzag pattern, making herself a harder target while bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. The tunnel entrance looked impossibly far away, but she pushed herself harder than she had ever run before. Behind her, she could hear the sergeant screaming orders, trying to coordinate his men's fire. The sound of rifle shots filled the air, but Sarah had caught them off guard. Their initial response was panicked rather than controlled. 20 yards from the tunnel, Sarah stumbled on loose rubble and nearly fell. A bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the heat of its passage. But she kept running, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate need to survive. The tunnel entrance gaped ahead of her like salvation itself. The family gathered their few possessions with desperate speed. The father wrapped their remaining bread in a dirty cloth while the mother bundled the sick baby in blankets. The 2 other children, a boy about 8 and a girl perhaps 10, looked at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. Sarah checked her ammunition one more time. She had fired 3 shots earlier, leaving 12 rounds. Not much protection for 6 people, but it would have to do. The sound of the searching soldiers was getting closer, and she could hear their radio chatter growing more urgent. "This way," Sarah whispered, leading the family toward the edge of the courtyard. She had spotted a gap in the wall that led to a narrow alley. It wasn't ideal, but it offered concealment and a route toward the village outskirts. The mother struggled with the baby, who had begun to cry softly. The sound, though quiet, seemed deafening in the tense silence. Sarah pulled out her water bottle and offered it to the woman, who managed to quiet the infant with a few drops on its lips. They moved through the alley single file, Sarah in front, and the father bringing up the rear with his kitchen knife still gripped in his white knuckles. Every shadow could hide a soldier. Every sound could signal discovery and death. Halfway through the alley, disaster struck. The 8-year-old boy, weakened by days without proper food, stumbled over loose debris. The crash of falling stones echoed like gunshots in the confined space. Immediately, shouts erupted from nearby streets as soldiers converged on their location. Sarah saw muzzle flashes at the end of the alley as the first soldiers arrived. She pushed the family back against the wall and returned fire, her pistol shots surprisingly loud in the narrow space. The soldiers took cover, giving Sarah precious seconds to assess their situation. They were trapped. Soldiers blocked both ends of the alley, and the walls were too high to climb quickly, especially with small children. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more hopeless than the last. Then the father surprised everyone. Despite his fear, he had been observing their surroundings with the sharp eyes of someone who had lived in this village his entire life. He tugged at Sarah's sleeve and pointed to what looked like a solid wall. "There," he whispered in Arabic, "behind those stones. Old cellar entrance." Sarah looked closer and realized he was right. What appeared to be a collapsed section of wall was actually concealing an entrance to underground storage rooms. The opening was small, barely large enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it offered the only escape route. Working together, they quickly moved the loose stones aside. The soldiers were advancing from both ends of the alley now, their flashlights cutting through the growing dusk. Sarah fired 2 more shots to keep them at bay while the family slipped one by one into the hidden entrance. The father went first, testing the safety of the passage, then helped pull his children through. The mother with the baby followed, struggling with the tight space but driven by maternal desperation. Sarah waited until all 4 family members were through before squeezing in herself, just as bullets began chipping stone from the walls around the entrance. The cellar was ancient and musty, filled with the remnants of stored grain and old pottery, but it connected to other cellars, creating a network of underground rooms that extended throughout this section of the village. The family clearly knew these spaces. This was their neighborhood, their home territory. For the next 2 hours, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the soldiers above. The military had brought in dogs to track them, and Sarah could hear the animals barking as they picked up scent trails. But the underground passages were complex, and the family knew shortcuts and hiding spots that weren't obvious to outsiders. The baby's condition was worsening. The infant was running a fever and had begun to have difficulty breathing. Every minute of delay increased the risk of losing the child, but moving too quickly would get them all killed. As they huddled in one of the deeper cellars, waiting for a patrol to pass overhead, the mother looked at Sarah with tears in her eyes. In broken English, she whispered, "Baby very sick. Need doctor soon or—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood the desperate urgency of their situation. They had to reach the safe zone soon, or they would lose more than just their freedom. The breakthrough came when the father remembered an old smuggler's route from his youth. During the previous war 20 years ago, rebels had used a series of connected basements and storm drains to move supplies around government checkpoints. The entrance was risky. It lay directly beneath the main road where soldiers had set up their command post, but it offered a direct route to the village edge. Sarah made the decision to take the risk. The baby's breathing had become increasingly labored, and they could hear helicopters circling overhead. The military was bringing in serious resources to find them, which meant their window of escape was closing rapidly. They moved through the darkness with practiced stealth. The father leading now since he knew the route. Sarah stayed in the middle of the group, ready to provide covering fire if needed, while the mother and children followed silently behind. The passage under the main road was the most terrifying part of their journey. Heavy boots marched back and forth directly above their heads, separated from them by only a few feet of concrete and dirt. Radio chatter filtered down through cracks in the ceiling, and Sarah could understand enough Arabic to know that the search was intensifying. At one point, they had to wait motionless for nearly 30 minutes while soldiers set up equipment directly above them. The baby started to cry, but the mother managed to muffle the sound against her chest. Sarah held her breath, certain they would be discovered, but somehow the soldiers failed to hear the soft whimpering below. When they finally emerged from the underground maze, they were at the very edge of the village, hidden among the ruins of an old grain warehouse. The safe zone lay across 2 miles of open farmland, clearly visible by the lights of the peacekeeping base in the distance. But crossing that open ground would be suicide during daylight. The soldiers had positioned snipers and observation posts throughout the area, and helicopter patrols swept the fields regularly. They would have to wait for full darkness and hope the family could survive that long. The father used the waiting time to scout their route, identifying drainage ditches and crop rows that would provide minimal cover. Sarah cleaned her pistol and checked her remaining ammunition. 8 rounds left. Not enough for a real firefight, but perhaps enough to create a diversion if needed. As the sun set, the baby's condition continued to deteriorate. The infant's skin was hot with fever, and its breathing had become shallow and irregular. The mother rocked the child desperately, whispering prayers in Arabic while tears streamed down her face. "We have to try now," Sarah told the father, "even if it's not completely dark." "The baby can't wait much longer," the father nodded grimly. He had reached the same conclusion. Better to die trying to reach safety than to wait helplessly while his grandchild slipped away. They began their final dash across the open farmland, just as the last light faded from the western sky. Sarah took point, using her experience in combat zones to choose the best route between cover points. The family followed in single file, moving as quietly as possible through the rows of abandoned crops. Halfway across the field, their luck ran out. A patrol helicopter equipped with thermal imaging spotted their heat signatures against the cooler ground. A spotlight blazed to life, pinning them like insects in its harsh glare. The helicopter's loudspeaker crackled to life, broadcasting surrender demands in Arabic and English. But Sarah knew that surrender meant death for all of them. The soldiers had invested too much effort in this hunt to let any witnesses survive. "Run," she shouted to the family. "Straight for the base. Don't stop no matter what happens." The family scattered according to plan, each taking a different route toward the peacekeeping base. It was their only chance. If the soldiers had to choose multiple targets, some might survive. Sarah drew her pistol and fired at the helicopter's spotlight, knowing she couldn't damage it but hoping to distract the crew. The aircraft pulled back slightly, and she used those precious seconds to sprint toward better cover. Behind her, she could see the lights of military vehicles racing across the field from the village. The final chase had begun, and everything now depended on speed, luck, and the courage of a family fighting for survival. The next few minutes felt like hours as Sarah and the family ran desperately across the remaining distance to safety. The helicopter's spotlights swept back and forth, trying to track all the scattered figures, while ground vehicles bounced across the rough terrain behind them. Sarah fired her remaining shots not at the soldiers, but into the air near the helicopter, forcing it to maintain distance and disrupting its tracking of the family members. When her ammunition ran out, she threw the empty pistol aside and focused entirely on running. The father reached the peacekeeping base perimeter first, shouting in broken English to the guards about civilians under fire. The international peacekeepers responded immediately, floodlights blazing to life and armored vehicles rolling toward the incoming refugees. The 8-year-old boy collapsed just 50 yards from safety, exhaustion finally overwhelming his small body. Sarah veered toward him without hesitation, scooping him up and carrying him the final distance even as bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. The mother with the baby stumbled and fell 20 yards from the fence, but peacekeeping soldiers rushed out to drag both her and the infant to safety. The 10-year-old girl had somehow outrun everyone else and was already being lifted over the perimeter fence by protective hands. Sarah crossed into the safe zone just as the pursuing government soldiers reached effective rifle range. The peacekeepers immediately formed a defensive line, their own weapons trained on the approaching military vehicles. International law was clear. Attacking a UN-protected safe zone would constitute a war crime. The government forces stopped at the boundary, their officers clearly receiving urgent radio orders. After several tense minutes, they withdrew, leaving only the helicopter circling at a distance like a frustrated bird of prey. In the medical tent, doctors worked frantically to stabilize the baby. The infant had severe dehydration and a dangerous respiratory infection, but the peacekeeping base had proper medical facilities and trained personnel. Within hours, the child's condition had stabilized, and the family was reunited in the refugee section of the camp. Sarah's photographs, safely stored in her camera's memory card despite everything they had endured, provided crucial evidence of military operations in the supposed neutral zone. The images would later be used by international investigators to document ceasefire violations and protect other civilian populations. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the communications tent, filing her story via satellite link. Her editor in New York could barely believe the account of her escape and rescue mission. "You realize you probably saved that family's lives," her editor said over the crackling connection. Sarah looked through the tent opening toward the refugee area, where the father was teaching his recovered children a card game while his wife nursed the now healthy baby. They had lost everything, their home, their possessions, their old life, but they were alive and together. "They saved mine too," Sarah replied quietly. The father's knowledge of those tunnels and basements made escape possible. "Without their help, I'd still be trapped in that village." The story Sarah wrote became one of the most widely read pieces on the conflict, bringing international attention to the plight of civilian populations caught in the fighting. More importantly, it led to increased protection for refugee safe zones and stricter enforcement of ceasefire agreements. But for Sarah, the real victory was simpler and more personal. 6 months later, she received a letter forwarded through the UN Refugee Agency. It was written in careful English by the 10-year-old girl, now living safely in a refugee camp in a neighboring country. "Dear Miss Sarah," the letter began, "my baby brother is walking now and says journalist as one of his first words. Papa says someday I will be brave like you and tell stories that help people. Thank you for running with us toward the light." Sarah kept that letter in her camera bag, a reminder that sometimes the most important stories aren't just observed and recorded, but lived and survived alongside the people whose courage deserves to be shared with the world.